Arranged via Prince Asiel, I was invited to interview Danny Davis, Chicago's very own Afro-American congressman. On entering the building, his display of achievements were certainly noticeable, brightening his office space, highlighting the reward of hard work and dedication. Firstly, Congressman, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to interview you. Could you kindly tell me about your life and your upbringing, please?
Well, thank you very much, and I am delighted to have this opportunity to respond, and I'm delighted that you're in our country because I think you bring a perspective from other places that we need to know a great deal about. I often say that when talking about myself, that I'm very fortunate. Or I might even say I have been truly blessed. Blessed to have grown up in an environment where there were people who had hope and who believed in possibility. My parents were sharecroppers. We lived in a little rural town in Arkansas. It was called the land of opportunity, but we also sometimes say it's the only state in the Bible. Noah looked over his ark and saw. But my parents were farmers. They were sharecroppers. It was a relatively new place because they migrated there from Alabama around the turn of the century, which really means that our town developed around that time. And so until just a few years before I was in high school, there was no school for African Americans in that town that went beyond the 8th grade. My cousin graduated from high school by himself. He was the only graduate from his 12th grade class. His name is Aubrey Vons. He's currently alive and well, lives in Detroit, Michigan. He graduated 6 years before my cousin, his sister, and I did, meaning that they hadn't had a high school in that town a long time for blacks. John H. Johnson tells the story, at least before he died, of having to go through the 8th grade twice because he lived in a little town not far from where I grew up, just like that, where there was no high school for blacks. And his mother told him, said, Johnny, when you finish 8th grade, we're going to move to Chicago so you can go to high school. Well, he said when he finished the 8th grade, his mother told him, said, Johnny, I didn't save enough money for us to move to Chicago, so you're going to have to go through the 8th grade again. And he says, Mama, that's all right. I'll just stop school and help you work and get the money. She said, no, you are going to school. And she valued education. So did my parents. Even though they didn't have much formal education, they valued it. And I grew up learning to read. And because I could read and was interested in reading, I read as a little boy everything I could get my hands on, including the Bible. And we used to have something at church called KYB Club, which meant Know Your Bible. And they would teach us Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Esther, Job, and Ecclesiastics, and all of the rest of that. So I just grew up as an African-American boy in a small town where people supposedly were disadvantaged. We were disadvantaged, but we were never poor. We didn't know anything about poverty because everything that you needed to live, we could produce. If you needed a dress, ladies knew how to sew, so they make a dress. I remember my prom date. She made her dress, and it was the most fabulous dress at the prom. And she was the most beautiful girl there. So people grow food. So we were never hungry. We always had great stuff to eat because everybody could cook. And you would relish the opportunity to eat because you knew whatever it was going to be good. Not many people managed to go to college. I managed to go to college. The state of Arkansas gave each high school one $50 scholarship for the valedictorian of their class. I was not the valedictorian. A woman named Lillian Dunning, who actually came to visit me last year on my birthday. She was the person in our class who was the valedictorian. Super smart, but she just figured she couldn't go to college. I asked if I could get her scholarship. So I got a $50 scholarship and had $20 in my pocket and went off to college on my 16th birthday. Here I am. I registered partially on credit because we had a great college administrator, a guy named Lawrence Arnett Davis. We called him Prexy. And all of the students who were around my time loved him to death. Prexy could walk on water. Prexy could tell us to jump in Lake Michigan. We'd put on our swimming gear and jump in there. He was just that good. And so I managed to go to college. No big deal. Just go to college. Left and came to Chicago and came to what is known as the West Side of Chicago, and deliberately decided it was the period of time there was tremendous upheaval. The Black liberation movement was underway. People were trying to find ways to. Dr. Martin Luther King was leading marches and demonstrations. Malcolm X was expressing thoughts and ideas. But I had read about this guy named Carter G. Woodson. We're getting ready to celebrate Black History Month in Chicago and all over America and in many places throughout the world. Well, Carter G. Woodson was a tremendous historian and teacher and educator, and Black history was on the rise. Well, I'd always had an interest in history, and because of that, went to meetings, and when people would be organized, and I would go and try to understand what they were talking about. But I also got a whiff of the political system because nobody where I grew up black was ever elected to anything. As a matter of fact, the person in Arkansas who was the very first African American elected to the legislature was one of my instructors in college. Henry Wilkins taught something called, it was teaching people how to communicate and how to talk. And Henry was the only person that I'd ever heard really talk about electoral politics. But historically, I knew that there had been a whole bunch of black legislators in Arkansas during the Reconstruction period. just as there had been black legislators all over the South, especially because that's where the big black populations were. Many people grew up not knowing that there had been black legislators or even a black governor in the state of Louisiana during the Reconstruction period. But because of being interested in that and trying to understand it, I read a great deal about it and knew that these things existed and that the Emancipation Proclamation, or Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves, wasn't just a one-shot kind of thing. That now all of a sudden the slaves are freed, but I had read books about slavery, up from slavery, the history of Reconstruction, and I would just devour that stuff. I'm saying I couldn't get enough of it. I couldn't put it down, learning how black slaves were treated and how people were treated. So I pretty much, during that period of time, decided, I didn't know how I would do it, but I decided that I would want to try to do something that would help change these traditions and these ways of treating people. I used to ask my mother when I was a little boy, "My dear," and she said, "Yeah, what is it?" I said, "Well, why does it seem like we do all the work and somebody else seems to get all the money?" I mean, why are some people rich and other people poor? Why are some people sick and they can't get to the doctor? And other people, if they get sick, the doctor comes to them. Why? She said, "Look, don't ask me all that stuff. There are reasons you'll find out. I just keep studying and keep reading, and things will be revealed unto you." And so it was kind of that kind of upbringing. It was that kind of environment. It was that kind of understanding of my parents and the other people that I was around. There wasn't a single black person in my town who had a college degree as I was growing up. Even the woman who was the principal of the high school didn't have a college degree, but the folks were political enough to make her principal because she lived in our town. And they knew that Miss Dooley, whose husband was a farmer like the rest of us, and who drove the school bus, probably had a better understanding of what life was like for us than some of the other teachers who may have come into the town to teach, but would go back home on the weekend. Or some of them could drive every day back and forth. So they had that much understanding of politics, of the politics of life, the politics of being influential. And so those things just started to, and then I'd go to church and I would hear the preachers preach and they'd talk about things that were happening. And I always remember one particular sermon a fellow preached, and all the things that were going on, he preached about Mary observing stuff about her son, this Jesus boy, that even before he became the Jesus, there were things about him she'd wonder about. And all these things, the preacher would say, Mary pondered in her heart. That how could a little boy be in the synagogue with the learned men, answering questions and asking questions, and hadn't been to school. I mean, where did this get this from? So I just observed, paid a little bit of attention, got interested, and ultimately got involved, deliberately living on the west side of the city of Chicago, because that was where I felt I wanted to be, to try and make a difference in the lives of the people that I lived around. When I went to get assigned to a school, when I decided to teach, the counselor told me about 2 or 3 different places, but he also told me about, as we talked, a special school for overaged underachievers. And he said, I think you would probably like that place based upon what I hear you saying. And so why don't you take a look at that and see if that wouldn't be a place that you wanted to go. And I did, and that just got me involved in community life in a broader sense that ultimately led me to decide that public office is a place where one can make a difference, because once you are elected, you get the opportunity to decide. Others can influence what goes on. Others can have a position. Others can advocate. But once you are elected to implement the intent of laws that get made, you have not only a duty but also a responsibility to make the most effective use of yourself to do that. So I've never considered being an elected official anything more than an opportunity first, a responsibility second. And if I'm not being responsible to those individuals who put their hopes and desires in me, I am their voice. And if I'm not carrying out their wishes, then I'm actually betraying the trust they've put in me. Like the song says, a charge to keep I have, a God to glorify, an never dying soul to save, and fitted for the sky. But at one point in there, it talks about the power that I have to do the will of those who sent me. And if I don't do that, then their trust I am betraying. So yeah, I've been very fortunate, very blessed to have the opportunity to represent people at the local level, at the county level, and ultimately at the federal level.
Congressman, could you give me insight into your struggles in city, county, and federal?
You know, trying to think of struggle, when people think of struggle, I really think of Frederick Douglass, who made a comment about struggle. And he said that struggle, strife, and pain are the prerequisites for change. And if there is no struggle, there is no progress. That the struggle must be a moral one, or it might be a physical one, but if there's going to be change, there must be struggle. And so if you're in pursuit of change, you welcome struggle. You don't run from it. You don't try and avoid it. You recognize it as a normal entity and part of the process. And so, yeah, I ran for public office as what is known as an independent in a system where people were always a part of the process, and you didn't hardly run outside that system and expect to get elected. So I never had big sponsors. I never had a bunch of money. I never had the guys calling the shots. I never was close to City Hall except one time, and that's when we put the guy in City Hall, when we elected a guy named Harold Washington to be the mayor, but that he was an outsider. We were the outsiders. And so I had a little difficult time. I ran in a race. There were 4 of us running. One person was the incumbent, but I managed to get into a runoff with that person. That was in 1979, and I have been elected to public office since then. I first got elected to public office in a runoff election and took office in April of 1979. I spent 11 years in the city council, most of which I was on the outside of the inside that ran things. Harold Washington became mayor as a result of not only his tremendous political acumen and personality, but also because of the issues that existed. In some places, people vote as a result of many different factors. Race and ethnicity in Chicago has been a big factors relative to voting. People think of race, they think of ethnicity. The politics of Chicago became very much like a feudal system where the big lord, or like it used to be if you study European history, where one guy is the king or the main person, then you got a whole bunch of earls, and you got some other people who are barons, and you got some other people who are part of the overlord system. And so politics in Chicago is kind of different turfs. This guy's in charge of this area. This person is in charge of that area. And of course, it was also the politics of ethnicity, because Chicago was a big immigrant town, and people immigrated here from all over the world, and so you had enclaves of ethnicities living together. And so this became an Irish area. This became an Italian era. This became a Greek era. Ultimately, this became a black area. This became a Latino area. This became an Asian area. Much of that still exists when it comes to high level. If you read the newspapers now, we've got a big mayoral election coming up where there are about 14 candidates, and so people are wondering what the black population is going to do, what the white population is going to do, what the Hispanic population is going to do. And so the first cut becomes that. I'm saying, who are the blacks going to vote for? Who are the whites going to vote for? There are some people, obviously, who vote on the basis of something in addition to race and ethnicity. For example, there's a large population of immigrant Africans who live in the town. And people are wondering, how is that population group going to vote? Who are they going to vote for? Are they going to vote for another person of African descent, or are they going to do something else? So all of those things then become a part of the factors that will determine the political representation that people will have and what they will get.
Could you give insight into the cultural representation of black people in federal government?
Well, blacks have evolved. Blacks actually helped build the White House, but couldn't get the benefits of the White House. Blacks built, I'm talking about with their hammers and with their nails and with their wood. A black person actually helped lay out Washington, D.C., a fellow named Benjamin Banneker. A lot of folks think it was just Enfant who was the main guy and all, but Benjamin Banneker and black slaves actually built many of the structures that exist in Washington, D.C. Of course, blacks have had to struggle to get access to jobs and work. And the best way to describe what the struggle has been like would be the song that says, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I've almost gone." I'm saying you create the opportunity, and yet you've had to fight and struggle to reap the benefit. You've had to, every step of the way there has been resistance. It reminds you of the song that Sam Cooke used to sing during what we call the real movement days. I was born by the river in a little tent, and just like that river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming, but I know some change is gonna come. Blacks have gone across the world fighting in armed conflicts, but soldiers went to World War I, came back from Europe, and couldn't ride on the front of the bus. After they had shot up and been shot at. Went to World War II and did the same thing, but couldn't go in clubs, couldn't go in places. Or there were fountains where I grew up that said, "Colored drink from this fountain, whites drink from this fountain." So the federal government now has hired a good percentage of African Americans. It is a good place for blacks to work. It has done better by African Americans than private industry. There are some entities, for example, the U.S. Postal Service in Chicago. If you are black, you can go there and get yourself a job. You can rise, but you can rise because there have been established procedures that have assisted. So blacks have fared better with the federal government than they have fared, or than we have fared with private industry. So there's a good, solid number of African Americans who work in the federal government not as many in a state like Illinois in state government, because some of the governmental installations and places are not located where blacks live and where blacks want to live. But the federal government has done a much better job of including African Americans than private industry has. So we can take some pride in that, but we never get to the basement and figure we're in the penthouse. I'm saying we've made progress, but we still have a long way to go. Long way to go.
Congressman, could you give an insight into your spiritual and cultural morals?
Thinking of what one would call spirituality or belief, if you're taught certain things, certain values, you learn those. If you're not, then those are absent. I take the position, and I am really thankful to my parents and to the generations of people that I come from and the people that I grew around. We were just simply practicing Christians. I mean, that's the only way you cut it. And the golden rule was the order in my house where I grew up. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so the golden rule, and you had to follow the rule. My parents, as were their parents and their parents, needed to have hope. Slaves needed to hope that one day they would not be in slavery. People who were discriminated against with regularity needed to feel that they could escape discrimination. I guess when I was 10 years old, I must have read Uncle Tom's Cabin at least 50 times. I mean, one of the books that I can never ever forget. And I remember leaving it out under a tree, and it rained, and I think I must have cried for a week because my book was gone, even though I had read it so many times until I knew the characters by name. Topsy and Tom. Spiritualism, I discovered, gives one a sense that yesterday does not have to be tomorrow, that you can overcome obstacles. All things are possible if you only believe, and if you would have the faith of a mustard seed that said, yonder's mountain be moved. But then if it does not, you get you some dynamite, some TNT, some nitroglycerin, and blow that sucker up. Or if you have to, you get you a chisel and just scrape it away. And if you do it consistently and long enough, change will occur. So I am so glad that I have come in contact with this kind of thinking and this kind of belief. But I also know that faith without work is dead. If you all that you do is believe, but don't do anything about it, the change does not come. And so, yeah, I know that to some people this thing of Christianity and this kind of faith, they think it's beyond the pale, that it doesn't make sense. But it gives you a sense of comfort when you are in need of something. People who know me know that I like poetry. And there's one little thing about faith that a woman wrote. And she says, often your task will be many and more than you think you can do. But start out today with faith in your heart and climb till your dreams come true. Often the roads will be rugged and the hills unsurmountable too. But God is a mover of mountains. There's nothing that faith cannot do. So climb till your dreams come true. So you need something outside of yourself to help fight your battles. And if you've got to fight alone, then you don't have help. But if you can be driving down the road thinking of stopping something, and then you think of maybe one of the songs, Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand, through the storm and through the night, lead me on to the light. The next thing you know, you're singing a different song. I can see clearly now, the sun will shine. And so, yeah, I'm a big believer in this kind of faith attitude. As a matter of fact, just the other night, the Congressional Black Caucus, not all 55 of us were present, but many were. We had a faith fellowship because so many of our members are ill right now and experiencing health challenges, until we just got together and had a little conversation and, reaffirmed for each other that, yeah, we're politicians. Yeah, we are elected. Yeah, we represent 700,000 people. Yeah, people call us Mr. and Ma'am and Sir and Congressman this. But beneath all of that, there are some needs that this cannot provide. And if you can say, in thee, O Lord, do I put my trust, then you're going to get a little help.
I'd like to thank you, Congressman, for taking your time out and speak with me, and I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you, and I trust that we have been able to convey progress is being made. Like I just mentioned earlier, 55 black members, African American members of the U.S. Congress. Many of them were elected in areas where there are not many African Americans. For example, in the state of Colorado, the percentage of African Americans in that state is 8%. We have a member elected from Colorado. We have a member elected in Illinois, where Lauren Underwood, whose district, if the population is 5%, I think that's great. So America is changing slowly. My district, I would say, is probably not majority African American at this juncture. We only take the census every 10 years, so we'll be recounting the population in 2020. But I know there has been substantial white growth in my district. Not black growth, because we've lost large populations of African Americans because we've torn down what was considered high-rise public housing units where low and moderate income people could live. Much of the housing that's been rebuilt or built is upscale condominiums that African Americans don't have the money to live in. And the most unemployed black people in America are right here in Chicago. We have the highest unemployment of ethnic group black individuals right here in Chicago. Practically every person you see that when you walk out the door up and down the street is probably going to be unemployed. And part of the unemployment here is we used to have large manufacturing outlets that have moved out of this area. And that kind of unemployment is not available here. And we've got to do something about it. And we've got to train people to be technologically inclined and ready to take the jobs that do exist. Thank you very much, and it's been my pleasure.